I'm delighted to be joined today by a fantastic panel. Next to me is Baroness Lola Young, a member of the House of Lords and the founder of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Sustainability and Ethics in Fashion. And beaming in from the US, very, very early morning, is Maxine Bédat, an author and director of the New Standard Institute, and Ken Pucker, who is an advisory partner at the private equity firm Berkshire Partners, and was also the former COO of Timberland. And Maxine, I wanted to start by coming to you because you've kind of lived this. You went from founding your own fashion company, Zadie, to moving out of that space and now being one of the driving forces behind the New York Fashion Act. So what prompted that change, and what is it that you look, when we talk about the need for a referee, what does that ref need to do?
Starting from, well, a background as a lawyer, but working in the fashion space and launching a brand. And what I realized is that what we wanted to sell, what we wanted to market about our sustainability, we had free range to do so. And what I also learned from that process is, as a brand, we shared suppliers with other brands. And so even if we wanted to do the right thing as a brand, we would have to pay essentially for all the other brands that were sharing our suppliers. And so it made it very clear. And while we were a private company, we were competing against public companies whose motive was to maximize profit. And so what we very clearly understood is that we were existing in the system that even if we did the right thing or were trying to do the right thing, we would never be able to do so. And the system certainly wouldn't be able to do so without some basic legislation in place. As Tariq said, there's no such thing as a completely free market, and that we need basic guardrails to make this market successful. And so that was then what led me away from the brand side, working on the New Standard Institute and ultimately supporting the New York Fashion Act, which would put these basic guardrails in place to allow markets to thrive.
And what are those basic guardrails that you're asking for with the New York Fashion Act?
Yeah, so it's really looking at the main areas of impact of this industry, and not letting every company define what sustainability means to them by how they feel that day. It's about labor and labor practices, because this is an industry that still relies heavily on real people, mainly women, mainly coming from the global south. And it's about chemical use and chemical management so that we're not using fashion to kill rivers and oceanways, and aligning a company with the Paris Agreement, ensuring that a company, which of course this industry is very reliant on fossil fuels, that they reduce their impact and reduce their fossil fuel use in line with the Paris Agreement. So just these very fundamental basic ideas about what does it mean to operate responsibly within a large market.
Right. And this is based in New York, but it won't just affect American companies. It's any company operating in New York with a revenue of 100 million, right?
That's right. Yeah. So the idea of the bill is, I think a good parallel is the fuel efficiency standards that came out of California, which ended up being a global standard because California has such a large market. This is the same idea. If it's a company doing over 100 million in global revenue, and choosing to sell to the New York market, they would be impacted by this bill.
And we're at a moment where there is a global push to regulate the fashion industry more. And Lola, I know that you've sort of been at the forefront of this in the UK with the Modern Slavery Act. What are the challenges facing policymakers when it comes to bringing in regulation? I don't think this idea of the need for guardrails is a new one. Why don't we have better rules?
Well, again, and it does come back to some of the things that Tariq was saying earlier. There's perceived not to be the need to regulate because the industries will self-regulate. And we know that's not true, but nonetheless, successive governments will always tell you it's too much of a burden on business to expect them to do X, Y, and Z. And it always is until we get the legislation to do it. People said that before we had the Bribery Act, and now people kind of take that for granted. And hopefully we're moving to a stage where even with the Modern Slavery Act, right, which focuses on labour exploitation and abuses, it was kind of reluctantly enacted. Interestingly, here, it was businesses that were at the forefront of that and saying this is not a burden. We really need to be able to have this law behind us to level the playing field, to use your sporting metaphor. So, but there's always resistance from some people within the business sector who don't want to be regulated, who are quite happy to make these claims for their own particular companies. So there's a raft of things. And whilst we say that you know, some governments will also tell you that it's up to the consumer, as they put it. I prefer to think about citizens because that's a more active concept than sort of passive consumers. And actually, it's not on consumers because we haven't produced the business models that have put us into this hole. So why should we be trying to do something about it? And what we can do is so small in comparison to business. So I would say, you know, the move towards a mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation, which is what the EU are currently considering, is the right way to go. Let's at least have a really informed debate about it.
And I think we're actually meant to get an update on that piece of policy tomorrow.
Oh, right.
On the first.
I'll be looking out for that.
I think the EU has a tendency to delay their policy disclosures a little bit. But Ken, I wanted to come to you because you have a really interesting perspective, kind of similar to Tariq, having lived on the inside and now being a little bit more on the outside. But, you know, at Timberland, we've spoken before about this being a company that really wanted to do the right thing, but that was very, very difficult. You know, what were the challenges there, and what do you see changing, if anything?
Well, I had the good fortune to work for Timberland for 15 years. It was both a public company, but privately controlled. The Swartz family had Class B shares with 10-to-1 voting rights. And I worked for the second generation CEO, Sidney, and then his son, Jeff. Jeff was committed by faith to this agenda of sustainability, and at the same time, because of the capital structure, controlled the company. And so if you go back as far as the year 2000, Timberland's mission was actually a blend of what he described as commerce and justice. Justice being a word that one doesn't often hear today in a business context, and yet at Timberland it had three distinct components. Those were global human rights, citizen service, and environmental stewardship. And if you just pick on one of them for a second, I can describe how difficult it is for an individual company outside the system to try to address something as systemic as climate. So the last 7 years that I was at Timberland, when I served as chief operating officer, we reduced our carbon emissions by an average of about 11% a year, while the company grew about 11% a year. And so you'd say, well, that's a pretty terrific performance. And yet, if you look at the footnotes under the charts that we supplied in our sustainability reports, you'd see that we reduced our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, not our Scope 3 emissions. And yet, as most folks in the room probably know...
Can you explain Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3?
Sure. Scope 1 and Scope 2 are really the emissions that are direct emissions within the company or for purchased electricity. Scope 3 emissions are 15 other categories, and they're all upstream and downstream emissions that aren't Scope 1 and Scope 2. And so in the case of most footwear and apparel companies, about 96 or 97% of emissions are in Scope 3. So what we were saying was we succeeded in reducing about 4% of our emissions by about 11% a year, but we didn't have information about the 96% of our emissions. And that wasn't because we were ill-intended, it's because it's very complex. To get that data, you'd need about 50 to 100,000 data points every 6 months, none of which were tracked. And so you think, okay, it's probably better now, right? Because I left the company in 2007, 2008. But if you look at reporting to CDP, which is the aggregator for carbon data, and just look at public companies, less than 50% supply Scope 3 information today. And so we're 25 years into trying to do this on a voluntary basis, to have companies measure, report, certify their results. And emissions over that period of time were up probably 45%. And so the idea that companies can do this on their own, or are incented to do this on their own, even well-intended companies, turns out to be really difficult. And so I agree with the group that systemic solutions are what's needed, because individual actors, even well-intentioned individual actors, can't do it on their own.
You know, Tariq, you've obviously been talking about this, not specific to the fashion industry, but for some years now. What kind of engagement are you seeing around more of a systemic push for change, for collaboration to try and get regulators to move? Is that happening?
It's starting to happen, but I think what needs to happen first actually is a narrative needs to turn, right? Because the narrative in the conversation that's being had today is a dangerous one, because it doesn't actually give the political room to give the kind of regulation we need. So I'd share an idea of the Overton window, right? People may have heard of this idea. The Overton window is this concept of the range of politically acceptable possibilities, right? Because I could say something on one end or the other. I'm not going to get elected, so it's not possible. And so one of the interesting ideas is that the Overton window can shift based on the conversations we have, public attitudes, and that allows someone to get elected to push something. And I think people have said for years now that the Overton window has moved to a point where we can fight climate change. I would say it actually hasn't yet. I'd say it's moved to a point where we all kind of know we need to do something, but we don't really want to pay the bill. And I say that as a society. And I'll give, because I'm from Toronto, I'll give a kick the Canadians an example here. A few years ago, there's a study and found 70% of Canadians want aggressive action against climate change. The same time that someone else did another study, and they said the average Canadian wouldn't pay $10 a month to make that happen. The funny thing was Netflix was $9.99 at the time. So it gave rise to a few headlines as that people wouldn't pay their Netflix subscription. I think that the challenge is that people aren't ready to make sacrifice. And the biggest concern I have is if the titans of business are out there selling a fantasy that aligns with their short-term interests, and let's be honest, I mean, like Larry Fink's 7 years old, right? Like, he gains the most from the system, is least at the risk of the consequences of inaction. It's the exact mirror opposite for her, his 22-year-old entry-level employee, right? She's at the entry level and is going to eat the consequences. And so you sort of see that they don't really want to have that conversation, but I think the world would be served if they came out and said, if Jamie Dimon and Larry Fink all said, listen, we can't solve this. We need regulation, because if we don't do this deal, we don't buy this asset, somebody else will go and do it, because that's how the market system is designed to operate. And one of the reasons I saw it so quickly is because I was a distressed investor. So there, people were saying, oh, if I'm a responsible person, I don't do this. And I said, yeah, that's nice, but like, I used to sit on the other side. We would excitedly jump in when there's an inefficient situation like that. So I think the real conversation, even before regulation, has to be, businesses and business leaders saying, look, we need a systemic solution. And that is not going to come from the New York banker community. Like, future historians will look really angrily at us if we leave the fate of the planet in the hands of the speed at which New York bankers ask to be regulated. So it's going to have to be like an alternate voice that comes out and says, listen, like I'm an investment banker, but I think we need to regulate to protect the ESG in particular.
Well, and also it sounds like what you're saying is we need to leave money on the table.
That's 100% it. I mean, because the money we're taking off the table right now is effectively borrowing against the prospects of future generations, right? I mean, young people look and they say, there's finite natural resources, right? And there's a short-term incentive to exploit them more than the public interest would allow. That is a textbook example of a situation where we need regulation to protect the public interest from elected officials. That can't happen if all these countries are all tethered together because there's leakage, and the one most powerful country has unlimited political spending, which pretty much gives the players who gain the most from the loopholes an almost unlimited ability to pay to keep them open.
And I think another interesting element of this, which Ken kind of alluded to, is that we're also playing with an information deficit, where we have very good information about the financial performance of companies and very poor information about the social and environmental performance. And I wanted to come back to what you were saying, Lola, about the role of the consumer. Because without that information, how can the consumer be held responsible to make good decisions if they don't?
Yeah, well, I think even with the information, so what is the information, right? You can reel off a whole heap of metrics. And, like we've heard of the example of the scope 1 and 2 and not really accounting for scope 3. You can reel off all of these things And what's the average citizen to know? What do even I know when I see all these figures? And that's why I think regulation has to step in for all the reasons that we said about needing to be systemic change. But that systemic change also has to happen within governments, because they're in thrall to certain kinds of businesses in whose interest it is to keep mining fossil fuels and all the rest of it, exploiting labour, as actually has been done for hundreds of years. So it's really that we've managed to refine this system to work to the benefit of a relatively small number of people who are ageing, like myself, as we're all ageing. But, you know, it's not borrowing, it's stealing from the future, to me. You know, and I think we've got everything sort of upside down. And if we don't have systemic change, it's not going to happen naturally or organically, or if it does happen, it will happen too late. And so government's got to step in, they've got to be really bold, but we have to tell them to be bold at the ballot box and in every opportunity on every platform, otherwise they will do nothing. And I have to say that there are some businesses, I don't want to tar all businesses with the same brush. There are businesses, for example, from the Corporate Justice Coalition, however flawed, and you know, you can always pick holes in some of the people who signed up to that. But by and large, the businesses that sign up to that, the NGOs that have signed up to that, and civil society that signed up to that, and investors, you know, really do want to make a difference, because they can see that time is running out, and they're very, you know, they very much recognise that we're not. It's not just Generation Z or Z or whatever you call it, but it's those to come after that we're really selling out on.
I think that's a really interesting complexity to get at as well, that there's not a binary good guys and bad guys. There's a lot of complexity in here. And Maxine, I think you've probably been at the sharp edge of this and, you know, thinking about what should go into the Fashion Act, because, you know, particularly in this industry at the moment, simply defining what it is we mean when we say we want a more sustainable industry and what we want it to look like is still pretty hotly debated. And, you know, I know, Maxine, that's been quite a journey with the shape of the Fashion Act. How has your thinking around that changed?
I mean, I think the impact areas haven't changed dramatically. I think it's how they've been defined and who's defining them, right? We've had an industry that has self-defined what sustainability means. So if they're, I don't know, building a basketball court in the back of a factory, they can celebrate that and call that human rights. But that has nothing to do with how much pay their workers are actually receiving, where do they live, can they feed their children and themselves. So I think the idea of legislation is that it also has to be very meaningful legislation. Is it actually addressing the fundamental problems, which are human rights related, water related, land management related, and climate related, and chemical related as well. It's not an endless list of things. It's the hotspots of the issues, making sure that the legislation is addressing the hotspots of the issues, and working from there. It's not an infinite number of things to address. We just have to really focus on where the biggest impact areas are and make sure that the legislation is addressing that.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, absolutely, but it also has to be vigorously implemented, because there's no point in having legislation that people can get out of doing. You know, so if you say something is discretionary or if you say it's mandatory. So I like the M, the big M, as it were, for mandatory. You've got to do this, you've got to respond to this. And we learnt this lesson from the Modern Slavery Act, which I won't go into detail now because of time. But, you know, if the government isn't willing to implement, to monitor, to make sure that people are actually prosecuted. Nobody's been prosecuted. Nobody's had an injunction issued against them for violating the law of the Modern Slavery Act, and I can name thousands of companies that have. So you've got to have something that's really vigorous in pursuing people who the organisations that don't live up to that legislation, as you would in any other area of legislation. Why should businesses be exempt?
Well, and I think that's, sorry, Maxine, go ahead.
No, it was just to completely agree with Baroness Young is you have to have responsibility for the businesses and you have to have responsibility for the regulators to actually ensure that the regulation is being imposed. And so I think that's the kind of the art and craft of legislation, and also making sure that we are, as citizens, again, as Baroness Young mentioned, pushing our regulators to pass laws that are actually meaningful.
Right. And I think it's interesting here to get into this idea that regulation is not a panacea, because we've been talking about this as such an important framework to move change, but it has to be good regulation and it has to be robust regulation. And you mentioned the Modern Slavery Act, and one of the criticisms that have been levied against the Modern Slavery Act is that it is just it's a requirement for disclosure, which doesn't necessarily change anything. So what should we be looking for governments to move beyond now if we're looking for real change?
Well, we should be looking at disclosure. We should be looking at exact kinds of disclosure, not just a kind of general, what do you think about modern slavery or environmental sustainability, very precise. We should be looking at what businesses will do to compensate when they do violate those laws, or when they discover through their wonderful due diligence that they are exploiting their labour, or they are poisoning rivers, or they are doing this. What are they going to do, not only to rectify that situation, but to remediate? Because why should, again, if it was a question of, me doing something horrible to you, and you would expect some kind of compensation if I've damaged you, and that's the kind of system under which we live. So businesses, again, should be compensating those communities and those individuals that have suffered as a result of their lack of attention to these details.
Which I think gets us back to why businesses are reluctant to support regulation, because that as a business is very scary, I would think. And Tariq, I'm curious from your perspective, how can a business sell that to an investor?
I mean, it's challenging, right? I mean, the lie that's been sold a lot is that it's in every company's own interest to fight climate change. That's definitely not true, because first of all, incentives in capitalism today are the shortest term they've been in decades. CEO pay is the highest been in decades. CEO tenure is the shortest. So they get paid pretty quickly. And so they care about COVID because you can't mess that up. In a few weeks, the place is on fire. The one that takes decades, they're kind of like, I'm not so sure about that. And the most efficient, unfortunately, profit maximization scheme in the short term is usually not to make expensive investments to be green. It's to market yourself as being green, to fend off regulation, and keep, it's like the tobacco companies. We know this is how it works. And so I think the biggest thing for finance is that we need to change incentives. Like the one secret to understanding financial flows, which the financial people will always try to hide from you, is that if you want to change their behavior, change their incentives. Right? If they make more money doing something, they'll do more of it. To make less. If you don't want businesses that kill people, then you make it illegal. If you want less pollution, you tax it. You want more stuff, you subsidize it. These are all fairly standard in economics. And I think the biggest point is we have to change incentives, because even disclosure alone, if you just disclose a market failure, it's kind of like VAR, right? But then there's no referee to give out a red card, right? It's kind of so. And I think on that point, I'd add to what Lola said. It has to have teeth. Right? I mean, again, if you have a referee and they appear and people are kicking each other in the face, and this referee clearly doesn't know how to take out a yellow card, they might as well not be there, right? You need to actually be aggressive enough, and you got to hand out a few red cards. And that will change behavior in no time in the financial services industry for sure. But that also is not going to make them money in the short term, and most of the people making decisions are getting paid in the short term.
We're at time, but Ken, I'm going to give you the last word as someone who's sort of watched the fashion industry for decades. Do you see any change, and do you see appetite for this kind of move within the industry?
I think it's appropriate that Tariq, you're talking about ESG, because the analog between ESG and sustainability in fashion is legitimate. Expecting consumers to understand the contents of ETFs is like expecting consumers to understand the difference between organic cotton and conventional cotton and being able to trace a supply chain. So I think expecting consumers to do this is a fool's errand. I do think, however, that it is in the collective interest of major fashion companies to raise their hand and act with courageous courage collectively to advocate for regulation, because they are beginning to see the impact of finite resources and climate change on their businesses. It's no longer a long out, perhaps threat. It's more imminent and real. And so I think what I would love to see is the top 10 biggest public fashion companies write an editorial to the Wall Street Journal actually advocating for something like the New York Fashion Act. Because if you're able to lift the floor and all companies are committed to the same set of outcomes, I think actually it won't end up costing more. I think we'll innovate to find better solutions. One example is renewable energy today is cheaper in 90% of the world than fossil fuel energy. And yet, countries like Vietnam run principally on coal. We need legislation to get support for developing countries to make that transition. And then ultimately, the fashion industry and others will benefit.
I think that's a great point to end on. The incentives right now aren't aligned, but if we don't act to change that framework, then we're going to deal with very serious consequences that are going to cost everyone. So Ken, Maxine, Tariq, Lola, thank you so much for your time. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.